Hello, friends. I'm Carol Deppy. I'm chair of the board of directors of the Open Source Seed Initiative. On behalf of the Aussie board, I welcome you to our first webinar. Aussie, as we call it, is an organization that's fighting for the rights of farmers, gardeners, and plant breeders everywhere to have full access and rights to the seed we need. The rights to plant, grow, save seed, share, sell, breed with it, use it however we want. We do this by working directly with plant breeders who pledge one or more new varieties they have created into our program. Thereafter, seed of their variety is distributed through cooperating seed companies with the Aussie Pledge, which says, you have the freedom to use these Aussie Pledge seeds in any way you choose. In return, you pledge to not restrict others' use of these seeds or their derivatives by patents or other means, and to include this pledge with any transfer of these seeds or their derivatives. There are now more than 500 Aussie Pledge varieties being sold by more than 70 Aussie associated partner seed companies. For more information about Aussie or these varieties, check out our website at osseeds.org. Today's webinar is Crowdbreeding, a new word for the unique, altruistic, open source, collaborative Dwarf tomato project. Speakers are Craig LeHoullier and Patrina Nuske-Small. When Craig and Patrina realized that there was a largely missing class of tomatoes of great potential importance, they set up and led a group of more than 1,000 gardeners to do the plant breeding work and fill that gap. Craig started seed saving and plant breeding while pursuing a career as a chemist. He is author of Epic Tomatoes and 3 other gardening books, which will be listed in the program notes. Patrina, located in Australia, pursued a career as a speech pathologist before getting interested in building better tomatoes. She made the 8 original crosses that gave the project its start. The Dwarf Tomato Project has released more than 130 finished tomato varieties, all Aussie pledged and available through seed companies in the U.S. I'll now turn these proceedings over to our intrepid moderator, Rachel Holtengren.
Thanks, Carol. So today we'll have a 45-minute presentation from Craig and Patrina, and that will be followed by 45 minutes of Q&A, which will also be recorded. And so I would ask that if anyone has questions, they please use the chat, which I will be keeping an eye on. And if you have questions later, I'll let you know that you can unmute yourself and ask those personally if you'd like to during the question and answer period. But until then, I'll ask that everybody please remain muted so that we can hear Craig and Patrina more clearly. So I'll turn it over to Craig.
It is so cool to see so many familiar names, and now I've got some faces to go with those names. There's Rachel and Carol, there's a lot of people I know in this talk. So this is really, really cool. Thank you all for coming. This is going to be a lot of fun. Thank you really also for hosting this. And this is Patrina and I actually get to interact, and she and I have been great friends. We're 2 of those great friends who have known each other for a long time that never really get to see or talk to each other. So this is a treat on so many levels. It's just unbelievable. So I'm going to share my screen and off we go. I'm one slide further. Crowdbreeding. So Carol mentioned unwritten books, and there's one of them that I do want to call Crowdbreeding, and I'm working on it, and I've been telling people for a long time I'm working on it. Epic Tomatoes and Growing Vegetables and Straw Bales came with contracts. This one I want to self-publish, and my discipline isn't always the best, and frankly, I just can't get out of the damn garden enough to sit in front of a computer and write it. It will happen. So greetings from Hendersonville, North Carolina, and I'm going to ask Patrina to share what it looks like in her area in a moment of Australia, but this is my backyard. I took this picture about 15 minutes ago. Straw bales are all out there being guarded by my dog Coda over there, ready to plant, just waiting for the weather to settle in. We have daffodils and tulips and azaleas and lilacs and redbuds all going at the same time. The birds are all singing. It's quite divine out there right now. Patrina, what's it like in your neck of the woods?
Today is a beautiful sunny day. It's a country town, a small country village that I live in far south New South Wales. And it's really beautiful because I've got mountains that surround my place. I can see almost 180 degrees of mountains. And I just love being able to see the horizon for a start. And, you know, I can't bear the thought of living in a city any longer, I'm afraid.
All right, we'll schedule the next Aussie webinar for your place. We'll all go out there. So buckle up. This is going to be kind of an interesting drive. I hope that you all enjoy. This was a few years into the project, and Patrina actually made the trip to North Carolina to attend one of our Tomato Palooza tastings. And this is Patrina and I on a very hot, muggy day when we were really at the very beginning of starting to get named varieties from our projects. And all of the tomatoes on that table were from our dwarf breeding efforts, and they were all available to taste. And we really knew for the first time that we were onto something, because there were lots of smiles and a lot of pleasure being elicited from the tasting of those tomatoes. We actually had to stand guard. We didn't want those seeds going anywhere because they were incomplete. They weren't stable. They weren't done yet, but it was a chance for people to try them out. Why did we do this project anyway? And Carol touched on this briefly. For my part, I was selling tomato plants in Raleigh, mostly heirlooms, for about 15 years. And one of the most frequently asked questions I had, what if you got that tastes great, but I don't have to climb a ladder to pick it? I can grow it in a pot on my balcony or deck or patio. And the answer at the time wasn't a whole lot. And at that time, Patrina and I had started getting to know each other through Garden Web. And it seemed like she liked to do crosses. And I had some good ideas about how to put a project together. So essentially, the project was born through a friendship born over the internet, Australia to Raleigh, North Carolina in 2005. And the rest is history. And here, this is an example of why we didn't have a whole lot to tell people at the time for what tastes great and grows in a pot. You had determinate varieties, such as Sophie's Choice and Taxi, a lot of the red marketable hybrid types that they're good for farming and machine picking and packing up in a grocery store, but they didn't taste all that great. And dwarfs, which I'm still trying to explain people what a dwarf tomato is, it is a third type of tomato that is very distinct from determinate and indeterminate. And at the time we started with this project, really all we could point people to were lime green salad and dwarf stone and new big dwarf and golden dwarf champion and dwarf champion, varieties that had actually been around in some cases from the 1880s. So the fruit was right there on the tree for us to pick. Here is a need. We viewed that container gardening was going to become more important and a way to grow gardeners. And yet we were a little bit ahead of the curve on some of the seed companies. And in fact, I remember having a chat with Rob Johnson. We're starting to put out some of these dwarf tomato varieties. Would you like to grow it? And he's like, well, our interest really isn't in container gardening right now. And he pretty much bypassed being in on the ground floor of some of these. So I think, Patrina, I would say you and I got a little visionary and a little lucky, wouldn't you say?
Yep. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It was perfect timing.
It was. And not that any of these are bad tomatoes. It's just the scope is very, very limited. So this is another catalyst. And this is one area where I get an idea. And I am a seed catalog collector. And so I was flipping through an Isbell 1915, and I saw this description for a tomato called New Big Dwarf. I think it was released in about 1908, but I didn't have that catalog. And it essentially gave the answer to the problem. How they created New Big Dwarf, a big tomato on a small plant, was to take the largest tomato in existence at the time, Ponderosa, which is a Henderson variety from 1892, and they crossed it with Dwarf Champion. And then I assume they did generations of work. They created the hybrid and then they selected, But lo and behold, they had this big tomato on a small plant. They said, I actually found this in the USDA, obtained a sample, grew it out, and there it was, beautiful big pink tomatoes on a nice tidy 3-foot tall plant. Now, Isbell and the people in the early 1900s didn't have the rainbow of heirlooms that we have today to use as breeding partners onto this set of fairly restricted and ordinary dwarfs. So in a way, Patrina, to me, the project kind of presented itself to us in all of the pieces. Anything else you want to say about the early stages of how we got into this?
Well, I didn't really know much about any of this, Craig, at that stage. All I knew was that you presented this sort of idea in Garden Web that wouldn't it be great if we could have some of those heirloom tastes and flavours and colours and sizes on a more manageable plant? And,
Yeah.
you know, we should do some crosses. And I thought, yeah, that sounds like fun. And so that was my early days. Yeah.
So the nice thing, there will be a theme through this, and it's going to be that word fun that Patrina just used, because this project, every step of the way was fun in it. And yes, there were challenges. We'll get into some of those, but there were surprises to find. And because Patrina and I are not trained botanists, instead of reading the book and finding out all about plant genetics, we did a Mendel. We sat in the garden, and instead of playing with peas, we played with tomatoes, and we taught ourselves dominance and colors and recessive traits. So this, in a way, is kind of the punchline of the project, after which we'll get into the details. But every tomato in that cutting board is from a dwarf growing plant. It's funny where I say we formally shut it down in 2018, because in a way, it still hasn't shut down. It's ticking along. But we now have 145 stable varieties, because we work them out until they're essentially open pollinated in various seed catalogs. And we'll talk a little bit more how we did that. However, this project would have gone nowhere without the talents and the enthusiasm and the creativity and the willingness of over 1,000 people the world over. Not all of those thousands stuck with it the whole way. And we're going to talk quite a bit about resources later on, but it's just been a thrill. So let's look about the parameters of this project as we set it up. All amateur, all volunteer, as far as we knew. And if people who were plant geneticists and botanists, if they wanted to jump in, they were welcome to, but that was not a prerequisite. The project leads make the crosses, and it could be Patrina, and later I jumped in and did some, and a few other people. We would grow the hybrids. Then we would distribute the F2 and beyond for dwarf selection. As we would say to people, you're now going to go dwarf hunting, and we would explain how that worked. Patrina and I tended to be the people that made the decisions based on the results. So I've got these 20 dwarfs from this cross. What do you think we should progress? And so we looked at parameters like taste and color. We didn't look at parameters like disease resistance and tolerance, and we'll get into that later on. So here's another unique part of this. If you find it, you get to name it. So we have cats represented, dogs, aunts, uncles, grandfathers, flowers, birds. You know, it was just great. And you get to see what people are really into by looking at what they named the tomatoes it. And that name would then follow it all the way through to stability. The new named varieties would be released when they're viewed to be stable, open pollinated. And generally with this dwarf project, if a lot of recessive genes are involved, we can get pretty good stability at the F6 or so. If we're incorporating quite a few dominant traits, we may have to take it out to the F8 or the F10. The profits are for realizing by the seed companies. And we wanted to pick out small seed companies that needed something to help them to compete with the big boys. This gave them something new. And we would have one of our growers like Bill Minke in Wisconsin grow out 2,000 or 3,000 seed. And then we would just send that seed with a description to the company. They would germ test it and package it and sell it. So there was some trust involved there as well, that those people that grew the seed were going to achieve what was described. And the only thing we asked is that a link to the project went in the seed catalog, and the names of every person. I've got a misspell there. I just saw. This is a new slide I did last night at midnight, Patrina. So there may be a typo or two. We have no Gales in our project, as far as I know. But project members, none of us financially gained from this. We wanted the gain to be for the home gardeners who finally had an answer to the question, what have you got that tastes great and grows well in a plot? And then we pledge all varieties to Ozzy. So I know Jack wanted us to hit this question early on, or at least hit it at some point. And I thought this is the perfect spot to bring it up. Why Ozzy? It reflects the nature of the spirit of the approach we used in terms of telling people what we crossed, how we did it, how it develops, invite them in, and essentially the story is out there, and it's essentially got that altruistic element of we're trying to do this for the home gardeners and the farmers that wish to grow them. So Ozzy seemed to be a perfect situation that they should be pledged to open source. They shouldn't be patented. They shouldn't be protected. They should be there for people to grow and save seeds from and trade and then use in their breeding project. So to me, it's a perfect fit. Patrina, anything else on how this kind of resonates with us, the whole Ozzy pledge?
I remember that I only first found out about Ozzy when I was watching a documentary called Open Sesame, and it had Jack in it, and I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. So I sort of followed up and sent Jack an email to say, look, you know, we're doing this project. And he said, yes, we know. and so it sort of all moved on from there. But I loved the fact that not only could you pledge new varieties if you bred them, but the sort of the partnering with the seed companies also sort of just broadens it out to make it just very doable, and where people can find out where to buy the seeds. It's fantastic.
I think it's kind of a match made in heaven, and it's kind of like our seeds are home to have gotten this pledge, and it all works out just great. So how did we do this? And I think Patrina may have her tools of the trade, and I have mine. Patrina's done far more. Well, at one point she had done far more crosses than I, and I've kind of caught up a little bit. But my friend Keith, KC Tomato, Keith Muller, kept hearing me talk about wanting to do crosses. So one day he sent me a veggie bee. And I've got my little vibrating wand, and I've got my nice shiny black spoon and my tweezers, and I've got a steady hand. And so what we do, of course, is we find the father, the dad plant, get the pollen out, and then we use our steady hands and our tweezers. And if all goes well, we remove the anther cone from a partially open, not fully open flower, because tomatoes, of course, are perfect flowered. And if all goes well, they pollinate upon opening. We wanted to catch it before that happened, or before a bee visited and made a cross that we weren't looking for. And dab the little pistil into the pollen. And I like to repeat that 2, 3, 4 times in a row, because you're plucking the anther cone off a slightly immature flower, and you want to make sure this works. I have a general success rate of about 25%. I'm kind of impatient. Sometimes I'm a little sloppy with my anther removal, or it's too humid and I can't collect pollen and repeat the cross. But if all goes well, I like to do 2 things. I clip the sepals on the flower so I can remember where it is, and I put a little twisty tie on it. And if you get a tomato, X marks the spot. If all goes well, you'll have your F1 hybrid between the indeterminate parent and the dwarf female. Patrina, do you do it similar to this? Or we've never really talked about how you do your crosses.
Pretty much. I actually take the anther cone off a little bit earlier than you do, and then I wait about 3 days before I apply pollen. And I try to apply the pollen 2 or 3 times over the next couple of days. But I also tie a little tag that I have written the actual cross parent, the father, more so, because I always use the dwarf as the mother.
Yep.
Being recessive trait, you can be sure that your cross was successful if you use the dwarf as the mother. But basically, it's the same thing, and it's just learning to practice without damaging the stigma.
Exactly right. It's really about slowing down and trying to get any kind of a tremble out of your hand and being patient. And I find it a lot of fun. So we've each got our R&D areas, and all of our volunteers have their R&D areas, but we don't have pictures of all theirs. But here's Patrina, and this is before you moved, right?
No,
Oh,
this
this is your new place. Wow.
Yeah, this is my new place. You can see a house in the distance. That's the neighbour across the creek and up the hill. But the actual block sizes are the same as if it were a suburban place. So there's only 20 metres between each neighbour on my street. But this is my backyard. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if you get this impression, but people come into my driveway and they look at these and they're like, those are the most beautiful tomato plants I've ever seen, because of the characteristics the dwarf gene gives them and makes them distinct from other tomato varieties.
Yeah, I think they're great. I love them as seedlings. They're just the cutest little things.
See, I told you this is fun. So these are various years of my R&D, and I've tried different types of arrangements. And I've found, like many people have, that when you grow really heavily yielding top heavy tomatoes in containers, putting a stake in the bag works only until they top over and you get the pickup sticks effect. So through the years, I've developed other ways to keep the plants upright. Here in Hendersonville, I can actually bang stakes into the ground and keep them upright. And this is a different view of my driveway. We were in a subdivision with a homeowners association, and my neighbors thought I was insane, but they did like, I think the reason they let us do this is because they get really cool tomato plants and tomatoes and other produce free for asking. So we bribed our way into be able to use our driveway in a very inappropriate manner for our neighborhood. Now that we're in Hendersonville, we have a very different setup, and in the background, you can see my straw bales with my indeterminate plants and some dwarfs in front of those. And I've taken this gravel part of my driveway, and this is where I do a lot of my R&D. What a great office it is to be able to just walk out and play in your plants. I mean, it beats my 25 years in pharma so much we won't even talk about it. A few traits of dwarfs. So we'll hone down a little bit further into dwarfs. The bottom two leaves are regular indeterminate or determinate varieties that show typical foliage, which is kind of relaxed, spread out. Regular leaf is lower left, potato leaf is lower right. So the left could be a Cherokee purple. The bottom one could be a Brandywine. The gene that produces the dwarf tomato creates another interesting two other interesting changes in the plant. It limits the growth. It thickens the stem drastically. In fact, people that grow these for the first time think there's something wrong with them because that central stem is so thick. But then it puckers up the foliage into a characteristic the old seed catalogs used to call as rugose. It darkens the color into almost a more bluish green tint. And my personal thought, Patrina, is potato leaf dwarfs are the most beautiful tomato plants of all. I mean, they are just unbelievable. Yep. And when we started this project, there was one, and we've kind of focused on them. And I think we must have 30, 40, 50 potato leaf dwarfs that we've released just because they are so cool. So growth habit, indeterminate on the left, that's Cherokee purple in July. You know, when people grow these types, that's 8 feet tall already. Where's it going to go the other 2 months of the growing season? This is what annoys people about indeterminates when they have physical limitation capabilities to manage it, or they have space issues. Determinate is the nice little ball of tomatoes in the upper right that are pretty, produce a lot, produce all at once, don't taste particularly good. So what I tell people about dwarfs is they take the best quality of indeterminate and determinate, the restricted growth habit of determinate, the steady fruiting throughout the season until frost or disease kills it, like indeterminate. And I tell people, if you have a Cherokee purple that's 8 feet tall by August, your dwarf will be at about 4 feet tall. And one of the hardest things is people all want to know how tall these are all going to get. And you all know with gardening how many variables there are. How many hours of sun do you get? how are you maintaining it? How are you feeding it? What is the weather like that year? So by telling them that they progress upwards at half of the rate of an indeterminate, it gives people a better idea of what to expect from this plant. Patrina, have you found it pretty similar in terms of the kind of that half rate of
Yeah.
growth upward?
Yes, definitely. Yep.
Great. And that's a cluster of 2 potato leaf and 1 regular leaf dwarfs in a 5-gallon grow bag in my driveway. And of course, any tomato, the more space you give it, the more it will yield. I grew a few dwarfs last year in straw bales, and I was picking 30 pounds of fruit off 1 dwarf plant. But you can get a good 15 pounds, 20 pounds of fruit grown in a 5-gallon pot if the plant is appropriately watered and fed. And, you know, with container gardening, you have to use different methodology from regular gardening. So this is just a little primer of some things that we've discovered, and some of this, I think Patrina and I may have already known, but indeterminate is, and we've used these gene characteristics to our advantage as we've done this project. Indeterminate is dominant to both dwarf or determinate. Regular leaf shape, the serrated edge, is dominant to potato leaf. Yellow skin color, so think celebrity, think Burpee's big boy or better boy. That's a red tomato, red flesh, yellow skin. Clear skin, think Brandywine. Same color, red flesh, but you've got clear skin, and the yellow is dominant. Red is dominant to pretty much everything. And what we're learning, and we still don't have all the answers to, is between orange and green, between yellow and orange. I don't know, Patrina, if you sorted it all out, but I don't have all the dominances of the subcolors yet if you start crossing the weird colors with each other.
No, I don't either, Craig.
And I'm sure there are geneticists on this call that would probably help set us straight on it, but I want to learn myself. So don't tell me. Fruit size is small is so strongly dominant to the point where when I crossed Mexico Midget, which is pea-sized indeterminate, with Summertime Green, which is a 1-pound dwarf, the hybrid was a less than 1 ounce cherry tomato. That small fruit size is just so incredibly dominant. Round is dominant unless heart is involved. And I found last year in doing some crosses that heart shape comes through in the hybrid. Stripes partially come through in the hybrids. And even some expression of anthocyanin comes through in some of the hybrids. So kind of cool stuff. And knowing just enough about this can help you be an artist and decide what you want to cross. Patrina alluded to this, and it's important. We use dwarf as the female because a successful cross will give an indeterminate plant in the hybrid, meaning do your cross, ripen that tomato, save seeds, grow it out. And if your plant is indeterminate, boom, you've got a hybrid. When you grow those hybrid seeds out, you get the typical Punnett square 3-to-1 ratio. 75% of your seedlings will be indeterminate. And in our project, for the most part, the people toss them because we're aimed at dwarfs. But sometimes my heart aches is at everything we're leaving on the cutting room floor. There must be so many cool indeterminates that we're just not even looking at. If a potato leaf was parent, 25% of that 25% will be potato leaf. So already now we're starting to make finding some of our combinations a bit like finding a needle in a haystack. Dwarf seedlings, they announced themselves really early on. I'm going to show a picture that Patrina sent me that she took. They're about half the height. They have much thicker stem, and it can take about 6 to 10 generations to stabilize a new variety that we identify and name at the F2 stage. With the last 2 slides, Patrina, anything you want to add to the traits and some of our little hacks and how we do this?
No, Craig, that's quite comprehensive. Thanks. I can't think of anything else.
Great. And here you are, your picture. Easy to see the indeterminates. The easiest place to see it is look at the cell in the right rear, and the stem is slender, and look at the seedlings in the right front. And the stem is relatively thicker, and the plant is half the height. And the other interesting thing that I just noticed recently, and Patrina, you may have noticed it before the cotyledons on the dwarfs tend to be a little bit more rounded, whereas the cotyledons on the indeterminates tend to be a little bit more elongated. Have you noted that?
Yeah, similar.
Yeah, very good. This is just Indeterminate on the left and Dwarf on the right to show that half height thing. These were seeded at the same time, transplanted at the same time, a different view. And you can also get a sense of the darker, the foliage is starting to crinkle up in that Dwarf on the right. So one of the things that we really wanted to play with this project is to increase the diversity of dwarf tomatoes. And this picture, I believe, was taken just a few years into the project, and every tomato on that table was taken from a dwarf plant, a plant that was about 3 or 4 feet tall in the driveway. I had tomatoes on that table that were 1 1/4 pounds. I want to ask Patrina for impression. When we first started getting into growing out some of the F2s, what did you feel like when you started seeing what some of these were turning out like?
Oh, it was just incredibly exciting. It was just amazing. Oh, yeah, it certainly spurred us on, didn't it?
And some of the color surprises. So Patrina made a cross between Golden Dwarf Champion and Elb, which is a yellow times an orange. And we ended up with this wonderful hybrid we called Tipsy, and it was red. I mean, so we have had genetic surprises show themselves to us, and that has ended up producing some of the most delicious tomatoes in our whole project. Did you have some real flavor hits, Patrina, early on as well that made you kind of go, our proof of concept is complete, we can do this?
I thought most of them were just amazing because I was just used to supermarket tomatoes, and I mean, it was just a revelation. But it was a lot of fun, sort of finding the different flavors, the sweetness or the tanginess, or sort of an almost complexity that you couldn't imagine that somehow was tied into the aroma and things like that. It was fascinating.
You were very descriptive in the flavors. And I remember, I think it was Uluru Ochre. You were using all kinds of adjectives to describe the flavor of that, right?
Absolutely. People used to look at me cross-eyed, but I really could taste all those differences. And then you'd notice a bit of saltiness or a bit of smoky flavor, or, and the complexity always just blew me away.
And you actually, I'm glad you brought that up, and we're talking about flavor, because you can look at leaf shape, you can look at plant habit, and you can look at fruit color and size, but you can't see flavor. And so one of the challenges when you start coming around to stabilizing these is you may think you have it licked, and you could grow 3 or 4 plants that look all the same, but the flavors are going to be really different from each other. And I mean, we both hit on that quite early on, didn't we?
Yes, and that's how you make a choice about which one to keep going with. Yeah.
And which ones to kill. Like you had a beautiful you had a beautiful tomato. You might have named it Banksia Queen or something similar to that came out of the Dopey line, and it looked beautiful, and we could never get the flavor, or you could never replicate the flavor that you found initially in any of the subsequent generations.
Yeah, I gave up pretty quickly.
So this is just an example of tomato genetics at work, and how you can look at a result and it may look totally wrong, but then when you go through the genes, it's totally right. So I crossed Cherokee Chocolate on the left. It's got crimson flesh, but it's also got that additional pigmentation that makes Cherokee Purple and Cherokee Chocolate and all of the other dark flesh tomatoes what they do. And it's got yellow skin. And that on the right is one of our dwarfs called Dwarf Mr. Snow, one of my favorites. White flesh, it's kind of an ivory color, clear skin. And in the middle is the hybrid, which I named Chalky, because Cherokee Chocolate, we need to call it Chalky. Red flesh, yellow skin, looks like a supermarket tomato. And I thought, bingo, my cross worked, because that is exactly what I would have predicted. That tomato in the middle exhibits all of the dominant traits, and it ignores all of the recessive traits. This is an aside, and this is for those on the phone that are it's not all about dwarfs, but breeding other tomatoes. And I'm only going to talk about this for 5 seconds. But I had this, what happens if I cross 2 great heirlooms what do you get? So two of my favorites are Cherokee Purple and Lillian's Yellow. And so I created the hybrid and I grew it, and that was it last year. And it was one of the single greatest tomatoes I've ever eaten in my life. So it's there. Anybody who wants to go out there and create a tomato that will be a real crowd pleaser, cross those two varieties. I'm not going to market it. I'm probably not going to create the hybrid anymore, but wow. This is how I learned that stripes are partially dominant and heart shape, where I crossed a stripe with a heart and I got for a hybrid, I got a slightly striped heart. So a little bit more about the project. When we started, Patrina came up with this great thought. Disney has dwarfs. We can name our dwarfs. Unfortunately, we ran out of Disney dwarfs quite quickly. You may wonder, where did Sleazy come from? Well, we ran out of dwarfs. So a rather twisted fellow from our project named Bruce in California decided to name his cross Sleazy. But grumpy, happy, bashful, witty, dopey, duck. And those are the crosses that kicked off our project. And Patrina will always be my hero for doing that first one. Sneezy, crossing Golden Dwarf Champion and Green Giant, just about everything that came out of that has been outstanding in flavor. And I think we have 10 varieties just out of that cross. That's Golden Dwarf Champion in the upper left, and that's Green Giant on the right. And that was really one of the only two hybrids that Patrina made from that first set that tasted really good. This is the full set of those tomatoes that I just showed, the Sleepy and the Dock and all. And we learned another important thing. You can cross your Indeterminate and your Dwarf. Don't expect your hybrid to taste wonderful. And if it doesn't taste wonderful, don't worry, because once you start growing out the F2 and beyond, the flavor reemerges. And I don't know about you, Patrina, but this was some of these hybrids were just uninspiring to eat, didn't you find?
I have to admit, Craig, that I actually can't remember. It's too long ago.
Oh, sorry, my photographic memory is popping up here, but
yes,
we had conversations about it, and I think we kept using the word, well, kind of bland, kind of ordinary, and but boy, did they pop after it. So just to show people a little bit of a selection of Dwarf Sweet Sue, upper left, bright yellow. My wife's name is Sue. I named it after her. It just turns out to be one of my favorites. That's how luck is involved here. Dwarf Speckled Heart, upper right. Fred's Tie-Dye, lower left. There's one of Patrina's very favorites, Uluru Ochre. And that was kind of, we discovered a color, wouldn't you say, Patrina?
Yeah, that was a really strange situation. And it was also a really unique situation in that usually in dwarf hunting, we only keep growing the dwarfs and we toss the ones that are indeterminates. But on this occasion, it was early in the project, and I decided to just grow a few of those determinates that we would normally toss. And I gave my brother some to grow out, and I was collecting samples from him, and I saw this strange looking tomato, really odd colouring, and I thought it looks like it might be going rotten, but I thought, oh, I'll take it as a sample and I'll save seeds. So I took it home, cut it open, and it smelled amazing. And I thought, it doesn't smell bad, I'll taste it. And so I had a taste, and man, it just blew me away. And I thought, oh, wow, okay, I wonder if I'll find a dwarf in the next generation, because this is not from a dwarf. And sure enough, dwarf hunting in the F3s, I found a dwarf. And so we now have Uluru Ochre.
That was so lucky. And really what this is the first black orange, because if Cherokee Purple and Cherokee Chocolate are black reds, and this is that chlorophyll retention genetics embedded into an orange tomato, what give it that dusky color. Firebird Sweet, that's of the Beauty line. That was Beauty King from Brad Gates times Dwarf Wild Fred. We got so many colors. Every color of the rainbow has come out of that cross. Tiger Eye, which is another version of a black orange. And this came out of Hardy, which is a heart-shaped metallic green striped purple that is, I named this one Dwarf Chocolate Heartthrob because it is a heartthrob. It is so unique and so beautiful and really delicious. And we have our first name variety out of a Mexico midget cross, which is Dwarf Eagle Smiley, which our volunteer Justin created. That yellow cherry on the right is the closest tomato I've tasted to Sun Gold. And Victory is selling it for the first time this year. I made cherry tomato pesto out of it, and the pesto is white. It is the most incredible thing. It has white flesh and yellow skin. We're also playing with the variegated traits, and we've got Pico's Pride and Walter's Fancy and Elsie's Fancy out of that. And we're just starting to play a little bit. I know Patrina's played more extensively with the anthocyanin with her series, and I'm trying to get really good flavor in anthocyanin, and so I'm hunting for it, and I think I'm getting close. So that's a little tour through our varieties. One of the mainstays of being able to manage a project is having a format that you can track results. And we were very fortunate from the very start, right from 2006, that a P2P formatted website called Tomatoville had just formed, and Craig, the owner, decided that it would be fine if we could take part of it and turn it into our playground. So in this slide, you can see we have a list of all of those families, and they're clickable. And if you click those families, you can get into all of the work that's going on in those families. If they're named, they'll have a name, the Tomatoville name of the person underneath, so Fisher 1611, etc. And on and on and on. We have, our entire project is sitting on this. We have the ability to post pictures. And so it's a nice format because you can create little mini stories. In some, I guess, Patrina, you could say they're novels in some case, because some of these have a lot of information. And then once we release a product, a variety, we go through and we chart out the genetics, the vial numbers, the generations, who worked on them, what we saw as a result. And it helps us to hone in on all of the work that we did along the way. We're going to talk about Tomatoville a little more in a moment. You also, everyone who works on this, we like them to have some sort of a format. I'm an Excel spreadsheet type of guy. I have my entire seed collection double cross-referenced, triple backed up. And so, you know, I have filterable columns, and I have the dwarf family, the variety name, who sent me the seed, reference vial number it was grown from, and fruit descriptions. And so that's kind of the maintenance that goes into it. And I know, Patrina, you were running the Southern Hemisphere branch of this. I had the Northern Hemisphere, but I would say it's not a data management nightmare, but there's a lot to juggle. I mean, from your point of view, what did you think about the information management?
I said, thank God for Craig. Oh, unbelievable, because I only had a small handful of volunteers, but you had hundreds, and you had to keep track of them and try to get seeds back from them, and, you know, take notice of their results. And so the data, the amount of data is, I can't even get my head around it.
I think it's fun, but anyway, but thank you. Victory Seeds from the start has expressed an interest in this project, and Mike Dunton, who owns Victory, is a really good friend of mine, one of my best friends, and he has created, he has pledged to carry all of our dwarfs. So we now release our varieties through him first, and then other companies pick them up. So how did we end up, you know, Patrina and I just talked about how we did it. Now we've got varieties. What comes next? So we chose this word of mouth method instead of a publicity method, where, you know, a Burpee catalog or other company, here's this featured new tomato, we're going to make a glossy cover picture of it, we're going to have an Instagram and a Facebook campaign. We just said, okay, seed company, here's some seeds. You know, I'll talk about it in my Instagram feed, and I'll sell seedlings now and then. But it's bottom up instead of top down. And I was really fascinated to see how this would work. So Our early adopters were Victory and Southern Exposure, Sandhill and Heritage, Casey's up in Canada, Tomato Grower Supply, Tatiana's Tomato Bay, Sample Seed Shop, Fruition. These are the small seed companies that all expressed an interest, and some of them carried 1, some carried 4. Southern Exposure is listing a few each year. People are putting their toe in the water. But Tasmanian Chocolate was one of our first releases, 2010. I 2 nights ago, I did a Google search. With no hunting at all, it's now listed in 20 different seed catalogs all over the world, places in Europe, places in, and then a 2011 release, Dwarf Sweet Sue, I found it in 12 different places. So they're kind of getting around just fine. And I think it's word of mouth. You know, when I go around the country doing my garden talks, I am not a big splash guy. I am a kind of a common man, bottom up, let's roll together and see how this works person. And this fit, I think, I don't know, Patrina, did this fit your style as well, to do more of a quiet launch rather, or soft launch rather than a big splash?
I didn't really think about it a great deal, because I thought, well, we've done the basic work. Now it's up to someone else to carry it forward. I just sort of watched what happened, I suppose. I didn't plan anything.
Are you pleased?
Delighted, absolutely delighted. Someone in Belarus has been in touch with me, and the people in Russia, Belarus, and some of those previous Soviet countries, they absolutely are, you know, 100% Dwarf fans, all of them. Yeah.
And I've talked to people in Philippines, Greece, Sweden, you name it. So now we get to a fun slide. And this is when we talk about so what did we learn? Maybe that's what we call this. What did we learn? What are the most important factors of doing a project in this maybe unique manner? It's really up to anybody on this call and others to decide how unique it is, but it's the one we chose. What have been our challenges? Resources, particularly consistent resources. People who just don't dip in, get 10 samples of seed, say, oh, that's kind of fun, didn't send any seed back, and they vanish. Now, I'm not complaining about that. It's just a fact. It's what happens. We've had other people that have been with us the entire time, and they've had their fingers in half of our releases, but getting consistent resources. The example I use on this is Seed Savers Exchange formed in 1975. They've never had more than 1,200 people actively listing seeds in their yearbook. So many are called. Few people are as insane as I am. You can get 1 million people in a room, and this type of a project may appeal to 1 or 2 of them. So finding those people are tricky. Adequate and consistent data collection. And I'm sure Patrina and I are just as guilty as this. The garden's season's getting busy, you're harvesting, you're cooking, you're giving things away, you're seed saving. Oh, I must have taken pictures of everything. You go back and look. No, you don't have pictures of everything. You don't have weights, you don't have data. That is a very disciplined activity that's taking place in a period of the year where you're really busy. Our collaborative working tool is great, and Tomatoville was perfect for us, but it's tenuous because the person who owns it has had it for 16 years, and other, Instagram and Facebook and TikTok, other social networking has taken business. Not that we're paying to use it, but he doesn't want to run a site that doesn't have a lot of activity because it's work. And so it could disappear at any moment. And if it does, all of our data is gone. Consistent return of seed samples. This is a pain in every regard, the barriers to seed sharing. And I perfectly understand why, because you don't want to get tomato diseases and other diseases infecting crops in other countries. But when we could bounce things back and forth and get 2 growing seasons into 1 calendar year, we were moving like grease light. And now we've had to sever the project, and it's hard for Patrina to get volunteers there. And so that's a problem. And even I got an email from Ireland today, somebody who would love to, he owns a seed company. How do I get these varieties? I don't know what to tell him. I don't know how we can get them. I can't do phytosanitaries. That's just a problem. And even Patrina and I sharing our varieties. how much have we left behind that we haven't explored? Each one of these crosses probably deserves hundreds of grow outs, but sufficient space and populations to explore all the possibilities and ensure complete stability of the releases. And maybe the biggest one of all, I get an email from Seattle. Craig, I want to grow a dwarf. Which one would you recommend? We don't know yet which one of our 145 will fail in Vermont, thrive in Seattle, be diseased in Arizona, delight people in North Carolina. And so again, we've worked a little bit with Seedling on this. And Patrina, you just said something great. We've taken it this far. I will now add to that. We have now taken it this far, but I'm not sure we can fulfill. It's up to us to fulfill everything now that's left on this to-do sheet, particularly the part about finding out how these things are going to do in different places. That's just, I think, beyond our scope. So Patrina, anything you want to add to kind of the challenges or any other challenges or aspects that came to mind?
I remember one of the things that I constantly worried about was people taking not very good photographs, because you need to have that pictorial sort of reference point to see color, to see seed location, to see even sort of skin color compared to flesh color and so on. There's so many sort of entries on my website that just don't have photos.
Well, but you have
frustrating.
To admit, but you know, Patrina, you have to admit the pay kind of stunk. It was zero. So so anyway, here's and I hope we can get into some of these in a little bit of dialogue during Q&A time, but here's Patrina's Dwarf Tomato Project website that she manages, and I manage one on my website. And it's craiglehoulier.com/dwarf-tomato-breeding-project, and or you can just Google Craig LeHoullier Dwarf Tomato Project, whatever. Patrina's is dwarftomatoproject.net, and I strive to answer all emails the day they come in. nctomatoman@gmail.com, and Patrina's email is chilichick@gmail.com. And often Patrina gets emails through her website that she bounces to me, which is kind of cute. It's like, I don't know if people don't know where you are or know where you are, but I'll get a little stream of email coming in from Patrina for things that only I can answer over here in the US. So I appreciate those. That, I believe, oh no, very important slide. Take a picture of it. So Patrina and I had a discussion the other night about, out of the 145, could we pick out some that we love to eat? And rather than having separate slides, I decided to put in bold those that we both love. And I've got some with my name after. And this doesn't mean Patrina wouldn't love them. It means that she just does not have access to a lot of our most recent releases. So we have released things that you haven't grown or tasted yet. And then Patrina has some that, it's not that I don't love them, it's just that they go to the top of Patrina's taste palette. And, you know, we've got a red, a pink, a purple, an orange, a white, a green, a bicolor, a purple. We've hit the whole rainbow with this list. And I'm trying to count the potato leaves here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of these are potato leaf dwarfs. So pretty cool. Anyway, the frustrating part of doing a talk like this is, I hope this is connecting with people, but it was really fun to do. And I'm so delighted to have Patrina at the other end. So grateful for all of you for coming. And just, I guess we're just ready to open it up and see what you got for us in terms of questions. Patrina, anything else you want to add?
No, I'm happy and content. Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you for being here, man, and all of your work and your friendship. It's just been wonderful. So.
All right. So we have about half an hour for questions from anyone who has one. If you would like to ask a question in person and not in the chat, if you would please use the raise your hand function to let me know that you would like to ask that question, or if you'd like to put it in the chat, we can take questions that way too. And if you're joining by phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute yourself.
It can't have been that comprehensive, folks. There's got to be questions. I've even got questions about, is Craig sane?
There's a question in the chat from Alex asking about, Craig, your comment about the hybrids that didn't have great flavor and sticking with them. They ask if you could elaborate on what sticking with them means. So whether that's to continue growing the hybrids and taste testing them as they mature, or something else. And at what point would you determine that the hybrid wasn't worth continuing with?
Sure. Patrina and I can kind of co-answer this because I'm thinking of Sleepy. Sleepy has put out some outstanding tomatoes, right? Rosella Crimson, Rosella Purple, Wilpena. Sleepy was just a 6-ounce red tomato that on a scale of 1 to 10, I would have ranked a 6. And so you don't then assume I've got a real average hybrid. I'm going to stick with it and grow it out and see what we find. And Patrina, you did a lot of the initial work on it. And I mean, your early finds with the Rosellas were amazing, flavor-wise, weren't they?
Oh, definitely. But I honestly can't remember the flavor of the hybrid. And also, I think, it's quite possible that I actually never did grow the hybrid, because I remember sending the hybrids to you.
You're
and
right.
Then you sent the F2 seeds back to me. So some of the hybrids I didn't even end up tasting, but I remember that we discussed that they were, weren't anything wonderful on quite a few of those early ones.
To elaborate a little more on Alex's question also, flavor seems to jump around a little bit. So let's say you've got a color and fruit size combination that's in a dwarf plant, and you taste one of them and it doesn't knock your socks off. You can do two things from that point. You can go back and dwarf hunt some more and try to find that color and flavor combination, and it's likely you'll have a better flavor. But you can also save seeds from that dwarf that doesn't taste so good and grow it out and potentially get a really outstanding result. And this is where, this is where when you can't see flavor and you can't see disease, the other one, and we didn't talk about it at all, if people want to ask questions about it, disease resistance, disease tolerance, that is a beast to be able to study. And so in our project, we kind of drew a ring fence around the fact we're going to look color, flavor, size, etc. But we can't really get ourselves involved with doing selections for disease tolerance, disease resistance, because everybody's garden has totally different populations, different diseases come in every year. You need to be able to definitely confirm the disease that you have. So that to me is another bit of work that's undone. And if anybody out there loves our dwarfs, but doesn't love how they handle disease, then certainly they're out there all ready to be then bred for increased disease tolerance with some varieties that would impart that. So I view these as building blocks and starting points. They're great for people's gardens as they are, but for those that want to continue to play and do crosses and breeding, I think we had 5 varieties to play with when we started. People now have 145 plus 5. They have 150 varieties to play with if they want to start breeding things to them. So as you can see, I have trouble controlling myself with my garden projects. My wife has learned to handle it over our 41 years of marriage, and she kind of lets me just do my crazy stuff out there, but it's fine.
I'll just add to that to say that, if your hybrid turns out to taste lousy, continue with it to the next generations, because don't throw it out and think, I won't bother with this one. No. Keep going and grow some generations and then see what you think.
Yeah, I think one more thing to add is we've done about 100 families, And I would say maybe 20 or 30 of them never really added up to anything. We never really found what we were looking for. And you have to know when you call it in. It's like,
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
know, Doc is one that I recall. And Bashful is another one that I recall. Stumpy was another one, but there's a few that just, okay, we got so many. Why do we bang our heads against the wall looking for something great from this one? Let's just move. But then you always get somebody from Tomatoville says, send me all your seed. I like a challenge. I'll see if I can find something. So you say, good, knock yourself out, go for it.
We've got, excuse me, we've got a question about one of the challenges that you highlighted on your slide, Craig, was the issue of seeds going between the United States and Australia. Someone's asking if you could elaborate more about how seeds were sent and what the challenges were in doing that, and when you stopped being able to send seeds between the two parts of the project, why that happened, and exactly how that happened.
I'm going to let Patrina handle that one to the start, because she is the one that kind of raised the alarm on this. And we can talk, should we talk about getting visits from the USDA and stuff? I mean, the whole thing was pretty freaky, but I'll let Patrina start the story.
Certainly for the first few years, there was no problem just sending seeds normally as you would with notation on it. We had to make sure we put lycopersicum info on the seed packets. That was essential, so that when they were inspected, they could see that what they were. And so the beginning, there was no problem. I think at one stage there was a slight problem where the permissions changed, but then it went back to being okay again. But in 2013, I had a visit from the USD, our quarantine people, sorry, to say that we were not allowed to send seeds unless they had been checked for various diseases, 7 viroids, I believe. And so they would require samples, and what they called a sample was something like 20,000 seeds to do tests on before they would allow varieties to come in. But Craig and I were basically only sending, 10 or 12 seeds of varieties back and forth for each one. There was no way that we could comply with that. And so it became just impossible. Also, the other option, of course, from Australia's point of view, was that I could provide them with seeds and they would grow, I think, 8 plants as a minimum. And they would grow them in quarantine, and I would have to pay for all of the workers who had to look after them for 8 weeks, and a certain amount per square metre of space in their facilities. And I worked out it would cost me $1,000 per variety to get the permission that they were clear to come in. So it just made it impossible. That was 2013, yeah.
And right around that time, I got a call from the person who owned Tomatoville saying, you're going to get a visit from the USDA, because they're going to visit and they're going to have a chat with you about sending seeds to Australia. And this is the first time I'd ever heard any of it. So I was a nervous wreck. So, so when I went shopping, I got home, there was a little paper on my front door. You've had a visit by the USDA. You need to show up at such and such a place. So I was like, man, what are they going to do? Throw me in jail for tomato seeds? Possibly. So I went down and met with them. They were all fine. They said, no, we want you to really know the regulations. We're trying to do everything the up and up, but the process was impossibly onerous and expensive at that point. And so we just had to sever the project. Now, so the implications for this, think of the Seed Savers Exchange and think of the amount of seeds that they share with people all over the world. And a lot of these are just slipping through. People are sending a card with one little packet of seeds in it. So there are wider implications in this. And I wish there were a way for, if you're doing research amounts, 5 or 10 seeds, there could be an exemption so that you could get, if I were to send Patrina 5 seeds of a variety, that would be all she'd need to get it in that variety into Australia to be shared with Australian seed companies, which would then allow that to be sold. But everything now is just so wacky and strict that, like I said, this person who emailed me today in Ireland can't get any seeds from these dwarf varieties because of all these different seed importation rules and needs for expensive phytosanitary certificates. So fortunately, we had done so much by that time, and we each had teams built up so that we could continue our work. If that would have happened in 2006, this project may have had a lot of trouble even getting off the ground. But it, so that's kind of how it all went down.
I continued on my own from that time, from 2013. Yeah, it's just been me and me alone.
So, other questions?
Yeah, there are a couple of people asking how they might get involved in the Dwarf Tomato project. And given that you said that it shut down in 2018, maybe you could talk a little bit about what it means that it got shut down.
Yeah.
And whether there
Sure.
are opportunities for people to be more involved if they're interested.
You can never shut this project down. So how can you shut this project down? There's still stuff we haven't done. When I made that slide, we kind of stopped talking about it at Tomatoville. We didn't have like 150 people involved anymore. But then something happened, and it was a book called Epic Tomatoes, and it was me going out and giving talks. And so it's still percolating along. Let's just say I sent seeds to about 100 people this year. And I have bags and bags of things that need to be explored. So I'm still willing. All people need to do is send me an email and let me know what kind of things they're looking for, and I'd set them off. And there's all, they can dwarf hunt. I can send them F2s or F3s or F4s. You wouldn't believe all the stuff I got, or maybe you would after looking at the talk. The project will probably end up having somewhat of a life of its own. It is too fun to stop. And you just want to start seeing how many recessive traits can I pack into a tomato? Can I do a heart-shaped anthocyanin, black-fruited, variegated foliage with yellow background foliage? And the thing is, you can. You just have to cross the right thing. So hopefully I'll be hearing from some people out of this talk, and some people will help me continue on. Just being a little understanding, it's kind of a busy time of the year for me with gardening. So I may get something to them this year, but it may be next year after I've done my seed saving. But there are possibilities. So I hope that helps explain that. Did I say yes, the project is still alive? Okay.
Someone asks about disease resistance. Craig, you talked about that being a really difficult trait to evaluate for. Have any crosses been made with known disease resistant lines, varieties?
They haven't yet, because in order to test them fully, you would need then to have sizable gardens with that known issue, or to have a known presence. I mean, when you think about tomatoes, you've got a host of viral diseases, a host of bacterial diseases, and a host of fungal diseases. So, so would it be septoria? Would it be early blight, late blight, verticillium, fusarium, nematodes? So you'd have to kind of pick, but then what do you use to cross it with? And if anybody is willing or able or interested in doing that type of work, because I think it is incredibly important, I'd be willing to work with them on that. But I want to talk a little bit about dwarfs and disease in general, because they are dense plants foliage-wise. So if you are growing them in a humid area or a hot area, you have to use really good garden hygiene, meaning space your plants adequately, maybe do some foliage pruning so you can get the sun reaching areas of the plant. Some of the varieties actually would benefit from removing some inner foliage to open the center of the plant up. And sometimes the fruit are just, this tomato doesn't have any fruit because they're all stuffed into the center of the plant, surrounded by all of these leaves. So when I showed that picture in Raleigh where I had them all lined up, that was like disease highway. And if we had hot, humid conditions and lots of rain, the early blight would just go right down the line, plant to plant to plant to plant. I don't spray, I don't use antifungals, I don't use any of that stuff. I use treat your plants well, feed them well, water them well, and if you see the slightest bit of septoria or early blight, get the leaf off the plant. And I've been able to carry them late into the season with really good fruit production. But if people have issues with fungal diseases with their indeterminate varieties, then they're probably going to have perhaps even more issues with foliage diseases for their dwarf varieties. Patrina, I don't know if you struggle with some of those foliar fungal diseases in Australia like we do here, but any comments about that, and also fruit set, maybe in the heat and what you've seen in general?
Certainly the diseases and things here, it varies from place to place where you are in Australia, and it's more humid where I am now than when I was in Adelaide. When Adelaide had hot, dry summers, and I didn't really have as much of an issue with diseases as I do here, perhaps. But I don't spray either. I don't do anything. I just let the plant either survive or die. But I do remove the suckers below the first flower truss so that there's airflow under the plant. And occasionally I do prune out some of the dense foliage a little bit. But other than that, I just let them either survive or die. Basically, I sort of figured that the ones that survive are the best ones to save seeds from anyway.
Darwinism at its best. All right. You're tougher on yours than I am. Yeah, I've lost some to disease, and you're right. It's kind of like a 2 or 3 strikes and you're out. And if you can't get something growing well, then it's probably it's got some issues in its genetics that's not worth pursuing. So, so I hope that helps a little bit. But yeah, anybody who has ideas about breeding some disease tolerance or resistance into some of these, shoot me an email and let's talk. I can be a kind of a consultant more than a pair of hands on that one, and just kind of guide you maybe to some really good varieties to use as models for, or things like that. I know all of these very, very, very well, except maybe the 10 I haven't grown yet, but I'll get to them eventually. Other questions?
Zach says that they bought Tasmanian Chocolate and Dwarf Eagle Smiley to grow this year, and asks for a recommendation of one more variety if they had to buy one, or if you
one more variety out of 143 other options. Okay, I can do this pretty fast. Eagle Smiley and Tasmanian Chocolate. Yeah, I would say Summer Sweet Gold. Love it. Or Uluru Ochre, if you want to make Patrina happy and yourself happy, because it is wonderful. How do you choose, right? All right.
Patrina, would you like to get to choose?
It's too hard of a question. I'd have to quote you at least 10.
Maybe go to our favorites list and pick one of those.
Well, I would agree with Craig. Summer Sweet Gold. I actually don't have that here. Well, I do have it here, but I call it Summertime Gold. Right. Because I use that as Summertime Gold, and I figured that being in Australia, that's fine, because that's what everyone will grow, and I'll call it that. Yeah, definitely one of the favorites as well.
William has a question about crossing dwarf tomatoes with currant tomatoes. Sounds like there have been a couple of varieties released from crosses with currant tomatoes, and they wonder if there are more releases forthcoming.
So the one that the first cross we've done, let me see, we've done Mexico Midget times Summertime Green, which created the Teensy family. We've done Mexico Midget, and those are currant tomatoes. Mexico Midget with Dwarf Emerald Giant, and that is, I can't remember the name of that family off the top of my head. I should, but I can't. Emmy. It's the Emmy family. What we usually do is take part of the word of one of the two varieties. So Emerald Giant became the Emmy family. I'm not sure how. Oh, Teensy was named because Mexico Midget is such a teensy little tomato. And I'm actually this year, at the suggestion of some friends in Florida, going to cross Everglades, which is a current type tomato that pretty much grows wild in Florida. It's a little pink, but it's got really good disease tolerance for there. I want to cross, I've already crossed Everglades with Rosella Crimson and Tanunda Red, but I just had a request to make it a little more fun and cross Everglades with some green ones and striped ones and brown ones. So I'm going to be doing that. What you tend to find is that tiny fruit size really dominates in the children of the cross. So pretty much what we've seen from Teensy, that's a pea size times a 1 pound, and just about all the tomatoes are variations on the size of a cherry tomato, from ½ ounce maybe to 1 ounce, with the occasional what we call mini beefsteak types. So, think of a little cherry tomato and flatten it and ridge the shoulders, and you get this cute little, looks like if you were to put a beefsteak tomato in a shrinking machine. So that's, I know you can picture it, can't you, Patrina, what those look like,
Yep.
those little flattened mini beefsteaks. So what we've not seen out of the current times large fruited dwarfs are anything above maybe 1 ounce or 2. That could be there. However, the purpose for doing it, the reason I did that for the people in Florida was to find out if I could create some varieties that would be bigger than Everglades and maybe give different colors or flavor characteristics, but also be able to withstand the conditions of growing in Florida. And I actually just had a Zoom with my friend Melissa down there yesterday, where we talked about the project, and they're revving a whole bunch of people up that are going to be doing testing. And that is the Evie family, Tanunda Red times Everglades. So yeah, it's work in progress. And that's another thing. Shoot me an email if you want to chat about that. It's how big am I going to make this project, Patrina, by the time we're done? But we're not done yet. Like I said, we're not done yet. It's a great question, though. And yeah, I mean, any of these topics, if I pick your curiosity or interest, we'll just take it offline. If you want to schedule an individual one-on-one Zoom sometime to talk things over, I'm a retired guy. I got lots of time to do these things. So,
Are you still working on variegated varieties, and have any been released?
Dwarf Walter's Fancy, which is a 8 to 10 ounce. It's essentially Dwarf Mr. Snow with variegated foliage, same flavor, same fruit color. Dwarf Elsie's Fancy. So Walter was my grandfather that got me into gardening, and Elsie was my grandmother, his wife. So I needed to name tomatoes after 2 of them. And then Pico's Pride is essentially like Patrina's Barossa Fest, only with variegated foliage. So it's a little kind of golf ball-y, bright yellow, delicious tomato on a potato leaf variegated foliage plant. I sent something called Sandy Stripes to Mike Dunton to grow out, and that is going to be variegated foliage, 3 ounce chocolate fruit with green stripes. So, but I've got so much more stuff that hasn't been explored. What I need help on is yellow leaf stuff. I've only just dabbled in chartreuse leafed things, definitely variegated, and antho. And so I'm just pushing the envelope, and I don't have the resources to do all the things I've begun. So this is where, if people express interest and you want to get into some really fun things, they may not all be delicious, they'll all be edible, but they'll all be interesting. And when people grow variegated plants, they either love it, or I have a neighbor that came over and said, I hate variegated plants. It looks like the bird pooped all over it. And I'm like, no, you're missing the whole point here. This plant is gorgeous, and birds can't do it to that effect. They're just not as artistic. They
Can't
do
paint.
well, they can't do strategic poop. They anyway.
Yeah.
I'm getting a little punch drunk now. I need to find my beer soon, but that's all right. Anything else, Rachel? I'm still, as long as people have questions, I'm here to answer.
Someone asked if you could talk more about how many iterations it takes before you would consider a variety stable.
Between 6 and 8, maybe up to 10. depending on how much they flop around. So the hardest, the hardest color to get stable seems to be red, because it's dominant and recessive traits just keep popping out of it. And if you're developing a regular leaf dwarf that had potato leaf in the mix, you see potato leaf popping out right up until the like 6th, 7th generation, until you can kind of cull them away. But if you're doing like a potato leaf yellow, you can get that really close within like 4 or 5 generations. So it all depends on the types of genes you're working with, how many of them you're working with. And this is where I trust Mike a lot, because he's growing like 20 or 30 of these plants out to sell them. And so he's getting a chance to examine our uniformity. And there have been a few things we've sent him where, Cache Valley strikes, it's supposed to be a brown. Half of his plants were green. I grew it last year, it was green. So he has to he's doing reselections for us and getting them stable before he'll release them. So he's actually kind of a breeding partner right now, as well as a seed company for us.
It also depends a little bit whether or not the 2 parents were fully stable. And
Yes.
Some of the crosses where I used an F5 generation, for example, that took a lot more generations to finish stabilizing the varieties.
I've actually done 2 crosses of Sun Gold, everybody's favorite hybrid cherry tomato, with dwarfs, and the jury's out. They're very difficult to work with. You get some really funky things. We've gotten some like unpleasant flavors. So whatever, if you're using a hybrid to create a hybrid, then you're actually loading in twice as many genes, and you can get a real mess on your hands. But everybody is kind of looking for that. I want the dwarf version of Sun Gold. They just need to try Eagle Smiley, and I think they'll be so close that they'll be absolutely delighted. Hey, Jack.
Hey, guys. Thank you, Patrina and Craig. Marvelous presentation. Fascinating stuff, and I've got some that I've been enjoying, some of the varieties. What about other companies? Have they shown an interest with Johnny's or Fenco, and what do you do with them? And supposing that, what do you say when a company wants to produce them?
So if a company wants to carry a variety that's already out there, I have to send them to Victory, because at this point, they have the standard seed. So for any of our release varieties, I have very, very little seed, because it's kind of like it's taken care of now. It's being fostered by a responsible parent. So what happens is I send them, and that's how Tomato Fest ended up getting a lot of them, is they bought them all from Victory. And you could have knocked me over for a feather when I saw Tasmanian Chocolate in Johnny's catalog, because I love Johnny's. They're one of my favorite seed companies. And I thought, whoa, this is great. And then today I saw that either Gurney or Henry Field is carrying a few. So, and I know Adaptive Seed in Oregon is starting to take a big interest in them. But if you look online, there's a company called Vertilume that I don't know much about, and a company called Renaissance. And essentially, as soon as Victory releases a variety, they pick it up, and now they're selling it. And so what this gives me is, if I want to know what people think of Dwarf Emerald Giant, now I can just Google it and look at how all of the companies carrying it describe it, to get a sense of what people think of it. So it's a little bit voyeuristic and vicariously enjoying it. But I actually, Mike allowed me to go into Victory and rate the varieties from my point of view, putting my name against them, because people tend to not like to rate things. And here's all these wonderful dwarfs, and only 10 of them had ratings. And I was honest. I've got some 3 stars, some 4 stars, some 5 stars, what they taste like, hoping that will entice people then to buy them and try them, because somebody is actually taking the time to go and review them. So there's lots of ways to kind of play in this project in different ways. The things I think about when I'm watching the Red Sox get beat at 10:30 at night, you grab the computer and start doing stuff.
Seems like we at Aussie ought to be working with you a little more closely to make sure that we get Aussie advertised and out there in front of people.
Yeah, I know Victory is very disciplined
Yeah.
about that. What would be really a good thing to do is to do a Google search of each name variety, see who's selling them, and do that double check to see if the Aussie moniker has followed the tomato over there. That's a great thing to do.
How would you feel if Seminus picks them up? I mean, if we had, I might feel okay about that if they were putting the Aussie logo on it.
You know, well, our project is to get seeds out for gardeners, and I don't want to control the vector by which they get out there. Where I would be upset if somebody grabs something and slaps a patent on it and says, you can't save seeds from it, or you can't use it to breed with. That's the line that would cross. Other than that, I mean, there's all kinds of seed companies, and each one of us who garden have different opinions about each seed company based on past experience, what we've heard about them. But everybody's trying to do the same thing. They're trying to get people to grow good food. They're trying to get gardeners and farmers what they need to succeed. So, you know, I'm just supportive of the cause of gardening. I'm trying to grow gardeners. That's all I'm trying to do.
Have you seen any IPRs being taken out on any derivatives? Nothing?
Not yet. Not yet. But I'm also not looking for it. Sorry about that. I'm also not looking for it because, as all of you know who are involved with projects or anything like this, you have to pick your battles. And you know, even the Dwarf project for me was a bit of a stretch because it was always heirlooms and stories and flavors and colors. And I didn't think I'd end up playing with plant breeding. I mean, this is the magic of Patrina and I meeting each other and something happening that neither one of us would have foreseen. I mean, a friendship grew out of it, a project grew out of it. And that's why I better get the damn book written, because the story about this really, I think, needs to be in print. And so some of you guys have to shackle me down or do something to make me write the bloody book so that it's out there. But like I told my wife, only Patrina and I can tell this story. It's not like I worry that the story is going to be stolen. It just needs to be told. So bad me. Got to write the book. Great questions, Jack. Thank you.
Well, I see that we're at time, so I would like to let folks know that Craig and Patrina actually have another half an hour to spend if anybody would like to stay on the call and ask more questions or chat. But that for everyone else who needs to leave, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you sharing your time, and we'd love to hear from you how you think the webinar went. So if you have any feedback that you'd like to share, you can reach out to the Open Source Seed Initiative at osseedinitiative@gmail.com. And I'd like to let you know that the second webinar in this series, featuring Dr. Michael Mazurek and Edmund Frost, will be taking place on May 11th at the same time as this webinar, so 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And they will be presenting on combining cucurbits for downy mildew resistance and more. So I will stop the recording now and thank everyone for joining.